So it's been a few weeks now that we've been looking at this relatively famous speech that Jesus gave and that we've come to refer to as the Sermon on the Mount. And today we come to the point where we're going to talk about the law and Christian ethics. And so this teaching is really, really intertwined with the teaching from last week. We're going to be going through the same passages that we went through last week. And so we're going to start with a little bit of review of the way that we talked about it last time. Last week we focused on the primary point that Jesus has been making in chapter 5. And that his audience thought that what they needed to do to get in good with God was keep some of his laws part of the time, at least externally, all right, and that would be good enough. And in fact, what Jesus is saying is that if you want to get to God through your works, then you have to follow all of the law, all of the time, both inwardly and outwardly. And sins of omission count just as much as sins of commission. All right, so it's not just things that you do not do. It's also things that you are positively called to do, like loving your neighbor. And failing to do that is just as much a sin. All right, so the standard that Jesus sets up is that you need to be perfect, just like God is perfect. And it's absolute perfection that we're talking about. And if you can do that, then, go ahead and march yourself into heaven based on your good works, and God will gladly give you a seat at the head of the table. Anything at all less than that, and you need huge amounts of help. All right, and that help can only come from one source, and it's the source that came to fulfill the law for you. And that's exactly what Jesus said he came to do. And so fulfilling the law includes completely canceling the debt, right? And so that's what Colossians says, that Jesus took our certificate of debt and he nailed it to the cross. And so, like, Jesus is paying for dinner tonight, right? Have anything you want. Jesus paid this horrific price, and the only way that any of us are going to walk in and receive acceptance from God is to trust in what Christ has done for us and to ask for that death to apply to our account. And so that's Jesus's primary point here in this section of the Sermon on the Mount. But there is other content here also. And that's where we're headed. So this teaching that Jesus is giving started out with those statements that we call the Beatitudes, right? Blessed are these types of people, and so on. And so in that case, blessed means happy. So he's describing what a happy life or a good life or a godly life looks like. And so when we look at the law of God in the Bible, we need to see that this law is an important source of understanding about what is moral or about what's right and wrong. And so we really can say that we are no longer under the law, right? That's from Romans 6:14. And we don't really count spiritual growth as coming from the law. So we're not under the law for personal salvation or for spiritual growth. But it would still be this colossal mistake for any Bible-believing Christian to think that somehow that this means that the law has been taken away and that it no longer matters. Right? Jesus explicitly said that that's not the case. The law is still very, very important. And so the concept of right and wrong is based on the character of God. Right? It's the way that God is exactly what determines what is right and wrong. And so these moral rules that are in the law reflect God's character, and they're binding on the entire universe. And they're just as much in force today as they ever have been in the past. Nothing has changed in that regard. And so this brings us to this area of ethics. And so ethics in this sense is kind of the study of morality, or the study of where and how we get moral norms. So what is our source for moral knowledge? And in this, as Christian believers, we have a different view than the culture that we're surrounded by. And so in the Western world today, most people believe that our sense of morality is at least partially fabricated and constructed culturally. All right, so different cultures construct different rules in order to facilitate social living. And so this is all just sort of an adaptive evolutionary feature of humans. All right, so we've learned to sort of restrict our more antisocial behaviors. And that's through this construct that we have named morality. And it's all just because it makes us more survivable as a species. Morality is, this thing that is widespread throughout all of humanity. It's everywhere you go in the whole world, but people have different ideas of what's right and wrong. And even though there seem to be a few things that almost seem like maybe they're universal, right? Like if you study closely, they don't really agree with each other about what's moral or immoral. And so since morality varies, there's really no way to say from one culture and into another that one system of morals is superior to another. And that means that we sort of have to just live and let live. We need to realize that moral standards are kind of a matter of personal choice, cultural identity. If all that stuff is the case, if that's truly where morality comes from, then the whole concept of morality is imaginary. All right, it's an illusion that we perpetuate for the practical reason of keeping people from killing each other and from stealing from each other, stuff like that. And so in that sense, morality really isn't at all moral. All right, it's actually just more like pragmatic. It's what gets the job done. It's what has the most useful effect on us. All right, but when followers of Christ speak of moral norms, and it's right and wrong, whether people know it or not. All right, we're talking about an objective moral norm that comes from outside of us, and it's true whether people assent to it or not. And so if you start torturing a child to death, it's not just someone's opinion that that's wrong. All right, that would be really wrong in the most true sense. All right, there are things that are like that. And any culture that wants to can agree that it has no problem with killing children, all right, or slavery, or no problem with killing a woman if she tries to learn to read. Okay, but that does not make those things moral. All right, so as Christians, we can agree with the secular world that a lot of the world probably does come up with their moral norms in this consensus sort of way. All right, that actually is what happens a lot of the time. But that doesn't make it truly moral or immoral. All right, we would argue that in addition to whatever is culturally constructed, there is a true moral norm that's based on the character of the one who created the earth and put us all here. All right, the Almighty Creator God. And He's a personal being and He's a moral being. And so the Bible's pretty explicit that God's righteous. He's good. And he's not at all into evil. And the Bible's also explicit that God wants us to learn to live the way that he lives. So if morality is rooted in the way that God is, and God is completely unchanging in his character, then these true moral norms that are based on the character of God would also be unchanging. And so our cultural opinion of what is right and wrong, or your personal view of what is right and wrong, doesn't really have anything to do with what we're talking about. And so there is a universal and overarching standard of moral good and evil which applies across the board to everyone. And so, like, even if 90% of Germany was in favor of Hitler, it's still possible to look at what was going on and say that it was wrong. All right, it doesn't make the slightest bit of difference how many people agree to a thing. And so, in a sense, this is like the true fundamental flaw of an actual democracy. All right, a democracy is set up to agree on a social contract, not on what is right or wrong. And so if, 3 dudes are stranded in a lifeboat and 2 of them vote to kill and eat the third guy, that is democracy in action. All right? But that's not morality. So as soon as the majority of people sort of get the wrong idea, the vessel starts, getting steered in the wrong direction. That's how a true democracy works. And so most of Western civilization would disagree with the idea that there is, outside of social contracts and themselves, an absolute morality. But this idea comes right out of the pages of Scripture. All right, so not only does our sense of what is right and wrong come from God and his revealed character, but also the moral prioritization that we should follow comes from him. God shows which moral issues are more important than others and which are less important. All right, so this is actually a pretty important point in the study of ethics. So consider this statement: when everything is important, nothing is important. All right, so you see what we're getting at here. And so this is the same concept of loving everything is the same as loving nothing, which is a line from a Dan Byrne song. The word important itself is a word that has to do with priority, right? Some things matter more than other things do. Some things are important and some things are not. And so if everything matters equally, then nothing can really matter, because there's no way to make a hierarchy of values. And this idea where everything is the same is not at all what we're given in the Scripture. We're in fact taught that ethics are hierarchical. Some of them matter more than others do. And this has nothing to do with some of them being more moral than others. So moral right and wrong is described at all levels, but some things are more important to keep if you have to choose. All right, so check out this passage in Matthew 23 where Jesus is criticizing the same people that are in his audience here in this sermon. And he says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin." So they had these little window garden boxes that they grew spices and stuff in. They were taught that they should give 1/10 of that stuff as an offering to God. And so they really were exacting enough to count out the leaves and, count out 1/10 of what they had total on their silly little mint plant and take it to the temple for God. All right, cool. But it's a ridiculously minor point. Okay. Jesus says, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. So Jesus is not disputing that the little things matter and are real, but their inability to have like a genuine sense of proportion or any sense of what actually matters to God has got Jesus' attention here. And so how concerned would God be if you managed to, pick off a tenth of your dill leaves and then turn them into the temple, right? It's important because he told them to do it. But is it even moral behavior, right? One way or the other? So you can't ignore crucial and central law that is about morality, like love and justice and mercy, in favor of this stuff that's really just about teaching people a principle. You see what I'm saying? So Jesus says, you blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. And so with these guys, it was not just that they failed to understand the truth of the scale of importance in moral thinking. It's that really they completely inverted the scale so that the dumbest possible thing was central to what they thought was important. And the most important things didn't even get done. And so we'll get into this a little bit more when we get to this section of Matthew. This is actually a thing that the religious mentality does, where our attention is sort of focused on the minutia of religious practice, and we're diverted from the big areas where we're completely failing to keep the will of God. And so, when we do that, we're able to get this sense of our own righteousness, but it's total garbage. And so I hope that you can see that tithing your spices is a thing that is much easier and less sacrificial than love and justice and mercy. All right, it takes no moral reflection at all to pull a few leaves off the plant. All you have to do is suppress some of your own greediness. And any greediness that you have to suppress is sort of made bearable by the fact that you get to consider yourself sacrificial and good by giving it. All right, anyone can do that. But a life that's lived full of compassion and justice, it's a different thing. And it's no wonder that we would rather just pull leaves off a plant. So let's look at another. This is Matthew 22:36. They ask him, "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" So Jesus does not say that all the laws are equally important. All right, that's not what he says. He says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second's like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So right there is where Jesus starts prioritizing things. All right, love God and then love others. All of the moral laws point towards these two. All right, this is what the law is all about. The law teases out the details of these things right here. So this is sort of the hub that the whole wheel turns on. And if your sense of morality or your sense of ethical teaching is not leading you to this, then you're doing it wrong. All right, you're distorting the picture that God has for you. One of his letters, Paul makes the comment that we know the law is good if one uses it lawfully. I think that's a cool thing to say. It's an interesting concept. Use the law lawfully. It's like using the law within the spirit of the law is sort of what he's talking about. And the point is that we need to handle the moral teachings of God's law in a way that accurately reflects God's character and doesn't distort it into some bizarre religious picture. And we can contrast that with this. All right, so John Wesley was a British preacher in the 1700s, and for the most part, this was an awesome dude. All right, he was certainly into God, and he certainly accomplished great things for God. But he's not very good at ethical prioritization. All right, he said once that I would not tell a willful lie to save the souls of the whole world. Well, that's very lofty. All right, sounds very high-minded and idealistic. But, I don't know, are his priorities really lined up right? Not one lie to save every soul on earth? Really? All right, so this is a guy that historians pretty universally agree was guilty of extreme neglect of his wife. All right, they had a miserable first 7 years of marriage, and then he left the house and kind of never came back. Totally not good to his wife. And then eventually she just left. And we have this diary entry from the day that she left, his diary entry. And it says that, for what cause I know not, my wife set out for Newcastle, purposing never to return. And then he throws in this nice bit of a Latin sentence, right? But it translates roughly to, I didn't ask her to leave, and I will not ask her to return. It's basically like, yeah, whatever. Bye. So, viewed from a biblical perspective, I see this as a complete lack of ethical priority. And so we sometimes just have these blind spots where the thing that we're fussing over should be the least of our worries. And the main thing that we're supposed to be doing to love God and love others is a complete failure, and it's right in front of us, and we can't see it. All right. So the next point here is that New Testament ethics are principalized ethics. It's not really a word, okay? But this is a slightly more complicated concept to get a hold of. In the Old Testament and in, legalistic religions, we have legalistic case law. And in case law, you're sort of trying to imagine every single situation. So if this happens, then do this, so forth, all right? And so you're trying to detail the boundaries so that someone will stay on the path all the way down the line. And in a principalized ethic, you have broad, principled ethics. Okay, and so for instance, Romans 13:8, Paul says, let no debt remain outstanding except the continued debt to love one another, for he who loves his fellow man has fulfilled the law. And so he goes on to unfold that, and he makes it really clear that loving others really is the fulfillment of the entire law of God. And if you're a legalist, then this kind of statement is going to make you kind of uncomfortable. All right, it's just too general. What exactly do you mean by love? All right, and who exactly is this fellow man that I need to love? All right, and so these kinds of questions pop up immediately because a legalist needs more detail for it to be spelled out more so that they can cross it off the list. All right, but you actually see in the New Testament that moral thinking is not consumed with specifics and details. It's the broad principle of moral behavior that really matters. And so 1 Corinthians 8 is a perfect example. The people are all worried about whether or not they should eat the meat because it may have been dedicated to one of the local gods or something. And so if they ate it, they might be like they're participating in some kind of idol worship. All right. And so that was a question that they were really worried about. And Paul's response is this really long discussion saying that they need to learn to apply the principle of love. And so he says that it doesn't matter what you eat What matters is the effect that you're having on other people. And in the summary, he says that what they need to do is when they go to someone's place and they set down dinner for you, don't even ask if it was dedicated to an idol. Just eat with them. All right. And so like a law liver or a legalist would just freak out at that point, right? Well, so can we eat the meat or not? All right. Paul says that it doesn't matter. And then he says if the host is boasting that the meat has been dedicated to Aphrodite or whatever, then you might have to say that you're not eating it, but it's for the sake of the conscience of the other believers that are with you. All right, so kind of interesting. So we can contrast this, New Testament principalized approach with the more case law legalistic approach that we find, for instance, in the Talmud on the subject of divorce. And so with certainty, the Talmud is an authority in the Jewish teaching that goes right up into Jesus's day. All right. So the Pharisaic teaching that Jesus was refuting was eventually codified into the Talmud. That's exactly where this comes from. So this is the type of thinking that Jesus is up against and that he's fighting against. And their concern here in this section that we're going to look at is with the validity of the divorce certificate. All right. And so the majority of what they're concerned with relating to divorce is with this validity of the divorce certificate and how you're supposed to write it and deliver it. All right. It says, if it was written by day and signed by day, or written by night and signed by night, or written by night and signed by day, it's valid. If it was written by day and signed by night, it is invalid. All right. It may be written with anything, ink, caustic, red dye, gum, copperas, or with whatsoever is lasting, but it may not be written with liquids or fruit juice or whatsoever is not lasting. It may be written on anything, on an olive leaf or on a cow's horn, and he must give her the cow, or on the hand of a slave, and he must give her the slave. If it was received from the husband by a minor who became of age before he delivered it to the wife, or by a deaf mute whose senses became sound, or by an imbecile who became sane, or by a Gentile who became a proselyte, it is still invalid. But if it was received from the husband by one of sound senses, who then became a deaf mute, and again became of sound senses before he delivered it to the wife, or by one with sight, who then became blind, and again received his sight, or by one who was sane, and then became an imbecile, and again became sane, it is valid. All right, and so then it gives us a few thoughts on the actual delivery of the note, which were too funny for me to leave off. All right, it says, if she's standing in a public place and he threw it to her, if it's nearer to her, she's divorced. If it's nearer to him, she's not divorced. If it's exactly halfway, she's divorced and not divorced. So it seems to me like they're not really sure what to say if it lands halfway, all right? Like, I don't know what that means. But the point is that there's this like engrossing interest in this certificate and in delivering it and in how it's written and all this other crap. And that is what we have to say about divorce, right? How far you throw the certificate, right? What about the moral dimensions of divorce? All right, and so it's really interesting that if you study the rabbinic teachings, they viewed adultery as wrong, mainly from the standpoint that it was theft. All right, you were stealing someone else's wife. And they didn't really bring up the sexual morality or immorality of the whole thing. And there's not one thing here about how divorce affects women in that day. All right. So anyway, this is a fascinating thing to look at or to study. And so Arthur Holmes has a book called Ethics that's a good little read. It's only about 150 pages. It's a good introduction to this topic. It's a decent book if you're interested in this sort of thing. All right. So our actual Bible passage here, we read this last time. It says, "You have heard that the ancients were told, 'You shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court.' But I say, whoever says 'you fool' shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell." All right, so hating or being mean to people is just as bad as murder from the standpoint of the justice of God. That's what we talked about last week. That wishing you could kill someone is just as bad as killing them from a holiness point of view. All right. So this week we're going to keep reading, and Jesus says, "Therefore, if you're offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift." So Jesus is prioritizing ethics for us right there, right? And so he's basically saying that unresolved or bitter relationships, not allowed. All right, something that is very, very common in human experience where you're not talking to someone or you don't like someone or whatever. All right, and that's not okay. It's not supposed to be going on in our Christian lives. And so people out there in the world, people at school, people at work, whatever, they're just like, "I hate that guy." All right. We don't get to play that way. Okay, no hating people for us. All right, and so John's pretty clear when he says that anyone who hates is like a murderer. Simply not part of how we do things. So Jesus is saying here that unresolved, bitter relationships are bad, and that dealing with this and fixing it is more important than offering sacrifices to God. All right, and the sacrifice was these people that he's speaking to, it's their primary form of worship back in the time that Jesus said this. And so this is before the temple became obsolete. When people wanted to show thanksgiving or worship to God, they just bring him an offering. All right, this is their primary way of worshiping God, and Jesus is saying not to come bothering to worship God when you have unresolved bitterness in a relationship. All right, that garbage you've got in your hand for God, drop it and go deal with like love and forgiveness and grace in your relationship. That's how God would most appreciate your worship. And then, okay, fine, it makes sense to worry about bringing God presents. All right, and so this is actually a really strong statement. Some of us maybe should feel a little twinge of conviction at this point, and so I bet that most of us can find some bitterness in our heart towards somebody, and yet here we are, right? Feeling good about ourselves for worshiping in the way that we are most comfortable with, okay? God's against that. All right, priorities. So you're not violating some stupid tithing of spices when you do that. You're violating the love your fellow man stuff. All right, that's the big one. And so you may need to resolve some stuff, and we should be able to figure out as we grow spiritually how to have conflict, because we're gonna. All right, but we need to figure out how to have conflict without having bitterness and without having alienation. So this is a huge thing that the Christian community should be doing very differently than the world. We should not just be walking away from people over conflict. All right, and so we see this all the time in all kinds of relationships, and it should not be the way that we live. This is immorality. This is against the character of God at a very high level. according to God. All right, and so he also brings up selfish anger, cursing people and saying bitter things about people, stuff like that. So blowing your stack at people is not really allowed either. It's destructive to relationship. And so some of us struggle with anger issues. And once where the anger switch gets flipped, we feel like kind of anything we say or do is excused. It's not, okay? People close to you may even be afraid of you. The people that you are supposed to protect and love are afraid of you. All right, because you're physically or emotionally violent. Think that through. All right, it's wrong. So he's got another one here for us. You've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. All right, so it's a capital crime in the Old Testament. It's a big one. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. All right, so this is a case where the people would have felt good about themselves if they had just followed the outward requirement that was given in the law. All right, but Jesus is saying that the law goes on down into the inside as well. And then he says that if your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you, for it's better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you, for it's better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go to hell. And so we looked at this last time. I'm not going to belabor it this week. But his primary point is that any kind of adultery or fornication or even lust, which is just thinking about it, is enough to make you fall short of the standards of God's glory, which is the standard that it takes to satisfy his insistence on total righteousness. And so if you're guilty of any of those things, you're in trouble with God, and you'll have to answer to his justice. Or you can get Christ to answer to his justice for you. All right, so that's the concept that the Bible puts forward. Jesus being our substitute to satisfy God's justice. But let's not miss the other thing here, which is the moral teaching that's going on. All right, so even if we're accepted as morally pure freely by the grace of God, that cannot mean that we go out and live immoral lives. And we're supposed to find that the experience of God's grace makes us less and less interested in living a sinful and or immoral life. And so understanding grace should not at all make you feel like you're forgiven and so I'm going to go do anything I want. All right, so anybody that feels that way has never understood grace and has no concept of the passion of Christ. All right, so understanding grace does not make you want to sin. It makes you want to be better and more like Christ. And part of that, as Jesus brings up here, is no more sexual immorality. And so we need to move away from this kind of thing. And this is an important one, all right? Jesus is singling this out, and he's using pretty emphatic language. He's marking sexual immorality as one of the big ones in this hierarchy that he's building of things that are more important than other things. And that's because it's so harmful. All right, so this kind of thing like lust can really fry your brain, takes over your mind, and you can become obsessed and have this virtually constant like sexual thirst, and your eyes become tools to this lust where you're constantly assessing everyone for their suitability, and you're kind of unable to put a stop to it. And this has a damaging and degrading effect on our mentality. And it casts a selfish, filthy haze over your view of other people. All right, viewing people lustfully is viewing people like they're objects that are beneath us and that are to be used as we see fit. And so this is not a desire to love another person and to share something with them. It's a desire to use someone else for self-gratification. And so it's sort of like a pornographic mentality where people are just dehumanized shapes. All right, this is degrading to human beings. And it certainly doesn't fall in line with how we're called to treat our neighbor. And it breaks down relationships, right? Not just with your partner, but also with your peers, which is kind of something I don't think we think about very often. And so you spend your time, your internal time, wallowing around in the garbage that's going on in your mind. You're not gonna share that with your brothers and sisters. All right, so since you spend all your time doing that, it's not like you're gonna have something insightful to say in your time with your peers, and you're gonna have to hide what's really going on in your thought life. And so you become more distant from everybody, including God. It's pretty hard to spend a bunch of time in like lustful internal thought and then just pick up with God like everything's cool. All right, this is destructive on every possible level. And one of the reasons that I think Jesus brings it up is because it is so damaging and so internal. All right, you can hide a lot of this kind of thing from a lot of people, but not from God. All right, so this internal sexual immorality stuff counts, and it's important. Definitely compromises the future or the present in terms of having a healthy sexual relationship of any kind. And so healthy sexual relationships take place in the context of commitment and attention. And so when our thought life or our physical life is very diverse sexually in terms of the people that we apply it to, we're degrading our own ability to give ourselves completely and make someone else feel like we're truly committed to them. And so sex has become like a hunting ground for my pleasure in society today, rather than a place where we give ourselves completely in a safe and committed place. And so our marriages are suffering because of both past and present mistakes in this area, and it can take a lifetime to recover from emotional patterns that we develop in our youth as it relates to sex. And so when God says that this is bad, all right, don't do this, it's not because he wants to cut down on our fun. All right, it's because he's trying to cut down on our misery. And so he's trying to get us to take it easy on ourselves, and he's trying to keep us from shredding the stuff that our souls are made of. And so when we dream of taking love from other people, then before long we are taking love from other people. We're taking the very thing that we're supposed to be giving. And so we need delivery from a life of lust, and God can give you that. All right, and the people around you can help with that. This is not something that very many people effectively get a handle on all by themselves. All right, help is a good thing. Coming clean and talking to your brothers and sisters or whatever about it is the way through this kind of stuff. All right, so Jesus has another one for us. It was said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. It's a pretty hard line, man, right? No divorce. But that's what it says. Selfish divorce is outside the holiness of God, and it's sinful. All right, so this does not mean that we have to submit to all kinds of abuse in order to stay married, but it does mean that all of those like run-of-the-mill difficult times that your marriage goes through are not reason for divorce. All right, you better have a reason that God can get on board with if you want to feel like your divorce is something other than self-indulgent. All right. Because divorce is a serious sin. And so our culture certainly wouldn't want to listen to this for very long. All right, we have a divorce rate over 50% now. If you get married today, you're more likely to get a divorce than you are for your marriage to last. And that's pitiful. All right, that's bad. And the statistics are exactly the same inside the church. How messed up is that? That should not be, that the statistics are the same inside the church. Kind of says something about what churches are prioritizing, right? Sure isn't relationships. And the Bible actually makes it much clearer and makes a much stronger case that divorce is a sin than it does about homosexuality. All right? But somehow, inside of Christian culture, we've elevated homosexuality to this place where God cannot abide that. All right, so neither can we. But divorce, kind of, soft on that one. Kind of got a soft line. All right, and it just shouldn't be the case. And it better not be the case moving forward. We know better. All right. Now, Jesus did give a caveat here. There are certain situations where divorce is justified. They're supposed to be extreme. All right? And so this one he brings up is a big moral issue that he just talked about. All right? That's why he brings that one up here. That's what he's talking about. Sexual immorality. All right? But we need to look at this inside of its historical setting. Malachi 2, God says, I hate divorce. All right, divorce was supposed to be a serious matter in this culture. And we can look at the artifacts and the literature that's been left behind and know the views of the rabbis when it came to divorce. All right, so on divorce, the Talmud, that's the book we were just reading about the divorce certificate, right? The Talmud says that all right, so the school of Hillel, that's the guy from Jerusalem in Jesus' day, he may divorce her even if she spoiled a dish for him. For it is written, because he hath found in her indecency in anything. If she messes up a dinner preparation, that's indecent, and she's out. All right, so Rabbi Akiba, one of the most famous rabbis of the first century, and he says, even if he found another fairer than she, that's a good enough reason for divorce. So basically, you could divorce your wife for any reason at all. All right, and on the other hand, the wife couldn't really divorce her husband for any reason. All right, just wasn't really an option. Does that sound fair? Right. And so if we tie this up with the implications of divorce for the woman in this culture, where they weren't educated, they couldn't be laborers, right? This is serious business. And so you take a woman that may be middle-aged and you divorce her, and you throw her out on the street, he could keep anything he wanted, including the kids, or he could make her take the kids with her. All right, so this was grossly patriarchal, and it was domination of women. All right, and serial divorces like this are just adultery with a thinly veiled pretense of marriage, all right, in the most legalistic possible sense. And so you could change partners just as if you were never married at all. And it's no wonder that Jesus is railing against this. This is sin. This is disregard for people. And it's selfish. All right, so the true intent of marriage is that it's a whole life commitment. It's absolute. All right, it's commitment from the beginning. All right, it's absolutely necessary for it to succeed. And we need that security. Marriage is not that easy. All right, there are some difficult times. And, in order to work through those, both people need to know that no one's going anywhere. And so you need that as a foundation or a starting place to work out the things that definitely will come up. All right, you commit yourself for life. And that's a denial of self. All right, it's self-sacrificing. It's an act of love. Unlike the way we do it today as a culture where, if it no longer feels good to me, then it might be time to move on. Everything in the end is sort of about my selfish prerogatives. Another one. Again, you've heard that the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. All right, so he's talking about the arrogance of making oaths on stuff that you have no control over or even any real knowledge of. All right, and so in the days before credit reporting agencies, people still needed to establish social trust, all right, about whether or not they'd be able to repay a loan or make good on some deal. So they would make these vows or oaths. And this is not just like casual swearing that Jesus is talking about. These are literally oaths where they would say, I swear by this or that may God strike me by some horrible thing if I do whatever. All right. And so this became very pretentious. And it's also very presumptuous to start talking about God and his world and what's going to happen in it, and even yourself, because none of those things belong to you, and you have very little control over any of them. All right, and so according to the Bible, you belong to God, the world is God's, everyone in it, everything in it belongs to him. And so these oaths are very arrogant in that sense. Instead, he says, let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything beyond these is of evil. One of the translations says, the one that we quote all the time, let your yes be yes, let your no be no. And so what he's talking about in this section is just simple honesty. All right, this is about the importance of honesty. No lying. All right, so we'll see in chapter 23 that he'll go in and he'll expose some of the tricks that were being used in these oaths that they're taking. And so they would swear by the temple, which sounds important, but they're not bound if they swear by the temple. But if they swear by the gold in the temple, then they're bound. All right, so they had these things where it was like they had their fingers crossed or whatever, all right? It made it so that it didn't count when they said their oaths. And they were using these like imaginary loopholes to rip people off, all right? And that's not cool. No deceiving, all right? So they would be able to say often, I didn't lie, all right? But they knew that the person was reaching the wrong conclusion, all right? Maybe they left out the key information to help with that wrong conclusion. And so, you may not have made a propositionally false statement, but you did present the material in such a way that they had to come to the wrong conclusion. All right, that's deceiving. He says instead that we should just have straight talk with each other. All right, be transparent. Your yes be yes, your no be no. All right, you don't need some triple whammy promise that like violates the truth and is degrading to God in order to promise something or to make a statement. And so you can start to see that the importance of honesty in the body of Christ and in the ways that the people of God relate to each other is really important. All right, so dishonesty breaks down trust and it breaks down relationship, and it's important that that not happen. And so it's important to be truthful. And we also need to avoid the arrogance and the presumption that goes along with these oaths that these guys were taking. And so that's another part of what Jesus is addressing here that's sort of outside the bounds for us, and we need to keep an eye on. All right, another one. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. All right, so now he's talking about lex talionis, the law of retaliation. We talked about this briefly last week. This is a legal principle. All right, and it was set forward in the Old Testament. It's for the government's use, not for individuals. All right, the idea is that the punishment should match the crime. All right, and the whole purpose of this law is to avoid blood feuds and to avoid unrestricted revenge, like the story of Lamech in Genesis 4. Guy insults him, and so he kills the guy. All right, and then a boy injures him, and he kills the boy too. So giving back like 10 times what you get in a revenge sort of way is not exactly a way to set up a functional society. All right, but that's the way human beings set things up on their own. And according to this legal principle, if someone commits a crime, then the punishment needs to be matched to it. And so we have every indication that the actual practice of pulling out people's eyes as a punishment was not really done. Okay, but rather if someone got their eye gouged out and it would come time to gouge out the other guy's eye as punishment, they would sort of just settle on a price for the second guy to keep his eye. And but as followers of Christ, we have a slightly different deal. All right? We can never take revenge. It's none of our business. And so in ethics, one of the things that's an important distinction for us to make is the distinction between individual ethics and social or governmental ethics. And so if you steal my lawnmower, I would be mad. No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't care. But Jill would be mad, and I would be mad that Jill was mad. All right? So I would probably try and get you to give it back. But I don't have the right to go to your house and tie you up and make you serve 45 days in prison in my garage. Okay, that's not my place. That would be weird. That would be wrong. Now, a government might do that, right? So it's appropriate for governments to engage in justice and the exercise of justice in ways that it would not be appropriate for individuals to. And so our individual ethic has to do with sacrificial love, turning the other cheek. So Paul explains this, Romans 12:19. He says, "Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says the Lord. But if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." So that's the principle that we're talking about for individual ethics. And this is really an exposition of the very teaching that Jesus gave here on the Sermon on the Mount. So this is a thing that's fairly unknown in all the world, where a person is going to mistreat me somehow, and I'm going to return that kind of treatment with kindness. All right, so Watchman Nee tells a story where there's a Chinese family that they have these rice paddies that are terraced on the side of the hill. And, this family would spend all day carrying water up the hill to keep their rice paddy wet. And the family below them would breach the wall at night, and the water would run down into their rice paddy. All right, so they're stealing the water that the people are spending all day carrying up there. And eventually, the family that was having their water stolen came before the elders of the church. And they said that this has been going on for like 3 weeks. Every morning, we repair our wall, and we fill the paddy up with water, and we basically just turn the other cheek. And this just keeps going on. So what are we supposed to do? And the elders go and they pray about it, and they come back and they say that this family has gone far enough to have demonstrated that they're not like the world. All right, but they have not gone far enough to demonstrate that they are like Christ. So the next day, they should get up extra early, and they should spend the first half of the day filling their neighbor's rice paddy and spend the rest of the day filling their own. So that's what they did. And within 1 week, the family that lived below them approached them and asked them about Jesus. All right, so they became Christians. And it's not just that they looked the other way and ignored it. Right? That didn't make that much difference. It was that they actually did good to these people that were doing bad to them. And that has power. All right, so people can't help but start to wonder what in the world is going on when something like that happens. All right, and so even if we did discipline someone, it wouldn't be a matter of revenge. All right, so discipline is done to try and help a person come to a change of mind for their own good. It's not because I'm taking revenge or because I want you to hurt the same way that I hurt. All right, last one. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven, for he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. All right, so it all funnels down to this bottom line. All right, this concept of sacrificial love. Loving even an enemy or someone that's against me, overtly showing them love, doing good for them. All right, has extreme power. Right? Just like what we read in Romans or talked about with Watchman Nee, really makes a statement to the person that's the enemy and to anyone who might be watching. All right, it's also very important, evidenced by the fact that Jesus himself said that the greatest laws has to do with loving God and loving other people. And this sacrificial love principle that Jesus lived by and practiced and demonstrated to us by the way he lived and by the way he died is something that we are supposed to learn to practice with others. All right, and so I think that you can see that the moral themes that Jesus develops here are still really important. All right, so then we come to the heart of the issue. And for those of us who take God seriously, the question that we have to ask ourselves is, are we going to be a taker? Right? Someone who's really just out for themselves, but is going to smear some nice religious camouflage BS over it so that we can pretend that I'm not what I really am? Or, am I really serious about this living for God thing? I'm here to, give out to others and demonstrate active love towards my neighbors. All right, it's really what it comes down to here. And, look at all these things that he mentioned. Hating people, adultery, divorce, phony oaths, revenge. These are all ways that I can go and rip someone else off to my own advantage. Right? It's exactly what Jesus is preaching against. So if we take a look at this big picture, one thing that we need to realize is that everything we're reading here in the Sermon on the Mount is actually real. All right, these are not imaginary, values that will never be lived. They can actually be lived in to a really substantial degree. And so hopefully they are lived to some degree right here. All right, and they need to be lived right here, right now by us. And we also need to remember that it's the Holy Spirit that changes people's lives. If you're here and you've never invited the Holy Spirit to become involved in your life, then this stuff that we're talking about may just seem impossible. All right, you may think that you could never live that way. And actually, that's true. All right, you can't. We are not able to change in deep and profound ways the way that God wants us to without the power that comes from outside of us and enables us to do things that we never imagined were possible for us before. And so we have to start the personal relationship with Jesus before we can expect to see these kinds of changes take place in your life. And of course, even the most mature Christians have not attained this fully. All right, but the question for our lives really is, should be which direction are we moving? All right, do we see forward momentum? Do we see forward movement under the grace of God? All right, that's what we need to pray for and strive for. We need to apply ourselves to spiritual growth in the belief that God is going to grant us like gradual and eventual freedom in each of these areas in order to create this new lifestyle and new heart posture for us. And so that would be quite a statement to the world if they could see a group of people that were living under the principle of sacrificial love and allowing that to govern their lives. That would be real evidence of the reality of God and of Jesus. And so we should definitely pray for that, work towards that.